Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Lostville Chronicles. Now, a lot of you listen to these stories late at night, some of you drifting off to sleep with headphones still in. So before you get too comfortable, let me ask you something. Have you ever heard of a child whose mind worked in a way that shouldn't have been possible? Tonight's story is one of the strangest historical mysteries ever hidden inside American archives. The case of a 10-year-old boy in 1891 who didn't think in words. He thought in numbers. Equations, patterns and formulas poured out of him like a language he didn't learn, but somehow remembered. Before we begin, comment below what state or country you're listening from. I always love seeing where our late-night history community is tuning in from. And if you enjoy these forgotten mysteries, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. Now, dim the lights, and let's begin. Cleveland Municipal Orphan House sat like a brick shadow on the edge of the frozen lake, its windows boarded in places where storms had torn away the shutters. Winter of 1891 pressed hard against its walls, the kind of cold that crept into floorboards and turned every breath into fog. The children slept six to a room, their blankets thin, their whispers lost beneath the hiss of steam pipes that barely worked. Dormitory C was the quietest of all. The smallest children were kept there, those too young to work, too gentle to fight, or too strange to place anywhere else. And among them was a boy who almost didn't speak at all. Isaac Granger, 8 years old, pale, thin, and watchful, in a way that unsettled even the older boys. He never cried, never shouted, never asked for more food or extra blankets. He sat alone on his bunk each evening, clutching a nub of broken chalk he had scavenged from the schoolroom. At first the matrons ignored him. Children scribbled on walls all the time. But Isaac wasn't scribbling, he was drawing. Strange shapes began appearing behind the bunk beds and along the baseboards. Spirals that folded into other spirals, grids divided into uneven segments, clusters of symbols no teacher recognized. Some resembled constellations, others looked like maps, but maps of places no one could identify. By the third week, Isaac had covered an entire section of wall behind his bed. The lines were too clean to be random, too deliberate to be childish. One matron scolded him for the mess. Isaac didn't defend himself. He simply lowered his eyes, as if the shapes were not drawings at all, but something he needed to place in the world. "It's a phase," the head matron insisted. "Some children draw monsters. Some draw houses. He draws whatever those are." But the drawings were only the beginning. Late one night, long after lights out, a younger matron making rounds patio used outside dormitory C. Something was wrong. The children were asleep, but through the door she heard a faint whisper, soft, rhythmic, almost like recitation. She opened the door quietly. There, sitting upright on his bunk with his back against the chalk-covered wall, was Isaac. His eyes were open, unfocused, staring at nothing. His lips moved slowly, repeating something under his breath. The matron stepped closer, at first assuming he was dreaming. Then she realized it wasn't English. It wasn't any language she knew. It was numbers, spoken in a steady, deliberate sequence. 7, 12, 12 again, 3, 9, 31, 1, 1, 1. She froze, listening. The numbers came in patterns, sometimes rising, sometimes falling, sometimes looping back on themselves. She whispered to him, asking if he was awake, but Isaac didn't react. His voice remained flat, distant, like someone reading from an invisible page only he could see. The next morning she reported it to the head matron, who dismissed it with a wave of her hand. "Children talk in their sleep. Ignore it." But the whispering continued. And soon, other children began repeating the numbers in their own sleep, as if Isaac's voice had settled into the room like a cold draught. By the end of January, even the matrons admitted something was happening in Dormitory C, and Isaac's drawings had begun climbing higher on the walls, forming patterns no one could explain. The matrons insisted the walls be scrubbed. Children misbehaved in all kinds of ways, they said. Chalk drawings, nail scratches, childish games that left marks on plaster. So one icy morning in early February, 2 staff members dragged buckets into Dormitory C and began scraping every spiral, grid, and symbol from the walls behind Isaac's bunk. The chalk lifted easily, the shapes disappeared, and Isaac watched silently from his bed, his hands pressed flat against the blanket, eyes hollow as winter glass. By supper, the walls were bare again. But at dawn the next day, the janitor unlocked Dormitory C, stepped inside, and stopped. The walls were clean. The floor was not. Almost the entire wooden planking beneath Isaac's bunk, stretching outward like the ribs of a wheel, was covered in chalk. Not scattered scribbles, not childish sketches, but equations. Long chains of them, columns that climbed from one board to the next, curved symbols tucked between straight lines, tiny marks placed so deliberately that the janitor had to kneel, squinting, to see them clearly. Some looked vaguely familiar, like the trigonometric notations he had once seen in an engineering manual from the railroad yard where he used to work. But others, he frowned. They weren't English letters. They weren't Greek. They weren't symbols he had ever seen in any American school. They twisted in ways that felt foreign, as if someone had bent mathematical logic into shapes not yet invented. He stood and called for the head matron. When she arrived, her irritation lasted only a moment before turning into something colder, quieter. "Who taught him this?" she asked. The janitor shook his head. "Ma'am, nobody in this building knows how to write half of that." Isaac sat on his bunk, feet dangling, watching them but saying nothing. The matron snapped, "Get a wet cloth. Clean it before the children wake." But the janitor hesitated. He couldn't explain it. The numbers unsettled him. The sequences repeated in a way that didn't feel random. Some spirals corresponded to the long lines of equations, and one symbol, a simple looping curve, appeared again and again like a signature. Isaac's signature. Still, orders were orders. He scrubbed. It took him nearly an hour. Chalk dust clung stubbornly to the grooves between the planks, leaving faint grey ghosts of symbols that water would not erase. By breakfast, the floor looked clean enough. That night, it happened again. When the matron checked Dormitory C before lights out, she paused mid-step. Fresh equations stretched across the floorboards, different from the morning's, but laid out with the same eerie precision. Isaac sat in the center of them, chalk in hand, as though he'd simply continued where some invisible lesson had left off. "Isaac!" she snapped. "Stop this nonsense!" He blinked slowly, looked up at her, and whispered a sequence of numbers so softly she barely heard it. 3, 9.14. She shivered, not because of the cold, but because his voice was not confused, not playful. It was certain. The next morning, the janitor tried again to clean the floor. The equations did not wipe away easily this time. And some symbols, the strange looping ones, seemed carved deeper into the wood than chalk could ever sink. The head matron did not want to involve outsiders. Orphan houses lived on reputation, and rumors could sink funding faster than winter storms. But after the third morning of chalk-covered floorboards, and after the janitor quietly admitted he recognized none of what the boy was writing, she sent a letter. It was addressed to Professor Edwin Hale, a mathematics instructor at the Case School of Applied Science in Cleveland. A stern, bespectacled man known for correcting colleagues as bluntly as he corrected students. He accepted the invitation reluctantly, assuming it would be a waste of his time. "Children draw monsters," he muttered to the porter who drove him across town. "They do not produce mathematics." Snow flurried over the orphanage roof when he arrived. The head matron led him into dormitory C without ceremony. Isaac sat on his bunk, knees drawn up, chalk dust smudging his fingers. The boy didn't look up when Hale entered. The professor glanced at the walls, scrubbed, then the floor, now clear. "I was told there were drawings," he said curtly. The janitor nodded, knelt, and pried up a loose floorboard he had kept aside. Chalk markings covered its underside, packed edge to edge like ink in a ledger. Hale held it up to the grey winter light. His expression changed immediately. He stopped breathing for a moment. These are not random," he said quietly. "These are solutions." The matron blinked. "Solutions to what?" He didn't answer. He was tracing a line of symbols with his thumb. Symbols he had last seen not in America, but in a German journal printed only for university scholars. "This," he whispered, pointing, "is Kroneker's unfinished proof. Unfinished in Europe, mind you. And here," he tapped another segment, "this is a corrected version of Riemann's failed conjecture, something no one has formally solved." The janitor frowned. "Is that good?" Hale ignored him. He knelt before Isaac. "Who taught you this?" The boy finally lifted his eyes, large, unblinking, calm. "No one," Isaac murmured. Hale swallowed. "Then where did you learn it?" "I didn't learn it," the boy said simply. "I see it." For a moment, no one spoke. The professor sat back slowly, as if the room had suddenly tilted. "You see it?" Isaac nodded. "When I close my eyes, numbers move. They fit together. They tell me where to go." Hale felt a chill crawl up his arms. This was not memorization, not repetition. This was comprehension, on a level he had never witnessed in any student, child, or adult. He reached into his leather satchel and pulled out a folder of his own research. Papers he had not shown anyone. "I've been working on this theorem for 2 years," he said. "I cannot make the third line resolve." He placed the paper in front of Isaac. The boy glanced at it once, twice, then quietly said, "Your middle term is backwards." Hale stared. No one knew about that error. No one. "Isaac," he whispered, voice trembling now. "How could you possibly know that?" The boy looked past him, toward the frost-covered window. "I don't know," he said. "But someone keeps showing me." Professor Hale returned to the orphanage 2 days later with paper, ink, and a determination he tried hard to disguise as professional curiosity. But the truth was simpler. Isaac Granger had unsettled him in a way no equation ever had. He needed to see more. Isaac sat cross-legged on the floor of dormitory C, chalk smudged into the cuffs of his sleeves. Hale placed a sheet of clean paper in front of him. "No walls today," he said gently. "Show me whatever you see." Isaac blinked once, then reached for the chalk. The first stroke curved like a spiral, wide at the base, and narrowing so sharply it resembled a shell or a collapsing storm. But then the boy added numbers, tiny ones, spaced between the lines, like stars pinned in a night sky. He worked outward, the swirl expanding, twisting, splitting. Hale watched, first fascinated, then alarmed. The paper filled with a pattern he had never seen. It wasn't an equation. It wasn't a map. It was something far larger, more intricate. A structure that looked simultaneously chaotic and deliberate, like the shape of a hurricane or the branching of lightning frozen in time. "Isaac," Hale murmured. "What is this?" The boy didn't stop drawing. "It moves," he whispered. "It always moves." "Moves how?" Isaac pointed to one cluster of numbers. "These go fast, these slow. These change everything." Hale felt his pulse spike. There was no way an 8-year-old could understand dynamic systems. Even the term didn't exist yet. Mathematical modeling of storms and fluid motions would not come for decades. He collected the paper, careful not to smudge even a corner, and hurried from the room. That night, he mailed copies to 3 colleagues, one in New York, one in Boston, one abroad. He did not mention the boy's age. He simply wrote, "Urgent. Examine closely." The first response arrived 5 days later. "Edwin, I do not know what I am looking at. The spacing resembles meteorological wave patterns, but we've barely begun studying such things. This seems closer to mathematics we have not yet developed." "Who authored this paper?" "Dr. W. H. Reeves, Columbia University." Hale read the letter twice, a cold weight settling in his stomach. 2 days later came the second reply, sharper in tone. "Hale, if this is a joke, it is not amusing. If it is serious, then whoever produced it is either a savant or a danger. Explain immediately. Professor L. Sydenham, Harvard. A danger." The word clung to him. Hale sat at his desk with the letters spread before him, the swirling diagram between them like a silent witness. He had believed he was documenting a promising mind, perhaps the rare brilliance that appears once in a generation. But this went beyond talent. It was as though the boy were writing mathematics from the future. The next morning, Hale returned to the orphanage before sunrise. He found Isaac awake, sitting on his bunk, staring at the frost-coated window. "Isaac," Hale said softly, "those papers you draw, how do you know what to write?" The boy didn't turn around. "They show me," he whispered, "when it's quiet enough." Hale swallowed. "Who shows you?" Isaac lifted his finger and pointed at the sky through the frosted glass. "Everything." They arrived before dawn, 3 men in heavy wool coats, their boots leaving sharp prints in the snow outside Cleveland Municipal Orphan House. The matrons had not yet lit the morning lamps when the brass knocker sounded, startling everyone awake. By the time Matron Fletcher reached the foyer, the strangers were already stepping inside as though the building belonged to them. The tallest produced a paper stamped with a federal eagle. "Major Whitcomb, U.S. Army Medical Division. We're here for the boy." "Boy?" Fletcher echoed, still groggy. "Which boy?" "The one designated Isaac Granger. We have orders to escort him for medical evaluation." Fletcher stiffened. "Evaluation for what?" Her question was met with a polite but empty smile. "Classified." 5 minutes later, before breakfast even began, soldiers were walking the halls with military precision. They checked doors, inspected rooms, eyed the children with the clinical detachment one might use on livestock. When they reached Dormitory C, Isaac was sitting on his cot, fully awake, as though he'd been expecting them. One soldier crouched in front of him. "Isaac Granger?" The boy nodded. "You'll be coming with us. Bring whatever belongs to you." Isaac looked down at his hands. "Everything I draw stays here." "No," another officer corrected, already sweeping chalk-stained scraps into a canvas bag. "All materials are to be confiscated." "What for?" Matron Fletcher demanded from the doorway. The tallest soldier, Whitcomb, turned to her. "Ma'am, you will refrain from asking further questions. This child is now under government supervision. Any obstruction will be considered a violation of federal mandate." Isaac stood slowly. His eyes drifted toward the floorboards where only yesterday he had drawn a lattice of numbers no janitor could understand. The boards had been scrubbed since Whitcomb's men had ordered it, but Isaac said. Till glanced at them as if the equations remained, invisible and alive beneath the wood grain. As they escorted him down the hall, the soldiers began gathering anything marked by the boy's chalk: broken pieces, scrap wood, notebook margins, even a section of wall paneling the janitor had failed to clean fully. Everything went into bags stamped with red wax seals. Professor Hale arrived half an hour later, breathless, clutching his coat. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "You can't simply remove a child without—" "We can," Whitcomb replied coolly. "And we have." "Hale is harmless," Isaac whispered to the nearest soldier. "You don't need to take his papers." But the soldier ignored him, continuing to sweep Hale's correspondence into another bag. Fletcher watched helplessly as a secretary produced several identical documents. "You will sign these," he ordered. "You will not speak of the boy, his drawings, or today's events to anyone. Violations will be prosecuted." The matrons signed, hands trembling. Hale refused until Whitcomb leaned close. "This is national security, Professor. Do not make yourself an obstacle." Hale signed. As Isaac was led outside into the cold morning, snowflakes drifting onto his hair, he looked back only once, at Hale, at the orphanage, at the world he was leaving. Then, in a voice barely above a breath, he said, "I didn't do anything wrong. I just wrote what I saw." The soldiers pushed him into the carriage, and the door shut like a coffin lid. The journey to Dayton took 2 days, though Isaac scarcely seemed aware of the passing fields and towns. He sat between 2 soldiers in a government rail car, hands folded, eyes fixed on the window as if watching something the others could not see. Sometimes his lips moved silently, counting, reciting, calculating, until one officer barked at him to stop. He didn't. Isaac's mind was too loud for silence. The Dayton facility did not appear on maps. It sat on a fenced hill outside the city. Long brick buildings with shuttered windows, a guard tower, and a weather vane that spun even when no wind touched the trees. It would be decades before the region became known for experimental aeronautics and strange military research. But the seeds were already here, behind steel doors and clipped voices. The moment Isaac stepped through the gates, the testing began. Doctors in white coats ushered him down a hallway lined with humming machines. Some were medical, others resembled early engineering prototypes. Pressure chambers, heated coils, vibrating plates meant to simulate motion. The air smelled of ink, iodine, and hot metal. They placed a sheet of paper in front of him. "Write anything you want," a doctor instructed. Isaac did. His pencil moved like a machine, fast, fluid, unstoppable. Within minutes, the page was filled with swirling equations that looked like wind patterns trapped in lines. He filled a second sheet before the doctor could pull the first one away. "Ask him where he learned this," one whispered. "Isaac," another said gently. "Who taught you these formulas?" "No one." The boy didn't look up. "The world talks. I just write what it says." For the rest of that day, and the day after, they pushed him from room to room. Heat conductivity tests, pressure simulations, acoustic resonance chambers. They placed objects in front of him: a kettle releasing steam, a spinning gear, a glass vial of metal filings. And Isaac wrote. He wrote about heat transfer, describing it with mathematics no American scientist had formalized yet. He wrote about pressure gradients as though he had lived inside storms. He drew particles, tiny, invisible spheres with arrows showing motion, long before atomic theory reached the public. When they asked how he knew these things, Isaac repeated the same quiet phrase. "The world talks." One doctor scoffed, "Nonsense." But his assistant whispered, "Are we sure this boy isn't listening to something real?" By nightfall, Isaac's small hands were smudged black with graphite. His fingers cramped, but he did not stop. When they tried to take away his pages, he reached out, not in fear, but urgency. "You'll need them," he murmured. "For the machines." "What machines?" "The flying ones. The ones that break the air." The doctors exchanged glances. None had spoken to Isaac about aeronautics. The Wright brothers' workshop down in Dayton was still years away from becoming military legend. Yet this child, who had never seen a blueprint, was sketching wings with strange curving angles and annotated vortices, as if he'd built them in his sleep. That night, as the guards escorted him to a small locked room with a narrow cot, Isaac paused at the doorway. He tilted his head as though hearing something in the walls. "It's loud here," he said softly. "The world is shouting." The guard frowned. "Shouting what?" Isaac looked up, eyes dark and heavy. "That something bad is coming." By the second week inside the Dayton facility, Isaac Granger no longer resembled the quiet boy from Dormitory C. His eyes, once curious and watchful, had taken on a hollow sheen, like a child staring at something far beyond the walls, beyond the world itself. The tests had multiplied. More doctors, more clipboards, more machines that hummed and rattled and made the floor tremble under his thin feet. They woke him before dawn each day. They kept him awake long after nightfall. At first, Isaac answered their questions in whispers. Then, only in nods. By midweek, he had stopped responding at all unless given paper. The facility staff soon realized something. Silence did not mean rest. Whenever Isaac sat alone, his hands twitched, like a musician hearing a melody he couldn't ignore. Once, a guard found him sitting upright in bed, drawing equations in the thin layer of dust on the floorboards with a shaking finger. When the guard wiped the dust away, thinking the boy was sleepwalking, Isaac flinched as if struck. "The numbers don't stop," he whispered to the dark. "They don't let me rest." The next morning, he failed to speak during tests, not from defiance, from exhaustion. He trembled whenever footsteps echoed in the hallway, as if anticipating another round of questioning, another room full of chalk and cold instruments. His hands shook so violently that one researcher tried to give him a break, only for another to override her. "We cannot slow down. This opportunity is unprecedented." "His mind is deteriorating," she warned. "It's still working. That's what matters." But the deterioration had already begun. 2 days later, Isaac refused food. He pushed away trays with barely a glance. He slept in short, shuddering intervals, waking with a gasp, as though numbers chased him even into dreams. The doctors started to record alarming changes: heightened pulse, shallow breath, erratic focus. One note simply read, "Subject appears afraid of his own thoughts." By Friday, he no longer lifted his head voluntarily. They placed a blank sheet of paper in front of him. He stared at it a full minute before his hands finally moved, slow at first, then faster, as if something inside had broken loose. 3 doctors watched from behind a glass window as Isaac filled the page. Then the table. Then the floor around him, swirling loops, sharp-edged grids, dense strings of symbols and strange ratios. Equations repeating, echoing, dividing until the marks seemed to vibrate. "What is he drawing?" one whispered. "It looks cyclical," another murmured, "like waves feeding into themselves. Or collapsing." When Isaac finally stopped, he pushed the last sheet of paper toward the nearest doctor without looking up. His eyes remained fixed on the corner of the room, wide, afraid. The doctor picked up the page. It wasn't just mathematics. It was a pattern, a shape, a spiraling structure folding into itself over and over, as though some enormous force was bending space in ways no scientist of 1891 could imagine. A prediction or a warning? It was impossible to tell. But one thing was clear: it terrified the researchers. Within an hour, the drawing was sealed in a black envelope, placed in a locked cabinet, and labeled only with 2 words: "Do not show." And Isaac Granger, the quiet child who once whispered in numbers, did not speak again for days. The order came before dawn on March 2nd, 1891, delivered not by courier, but by two men in long wool coats who arrived through the snow without announcing themselves. The night guards swore they materialized out of the darkness like shadows that had suddenly learned to walk. They carried no military insignia, no credentials they were willing to show, only a sealed envelope stamped with a crest the Dayton staff did not recognize. The envelope was handed directly to the facility's director, Dr. Harrington. He read it once, his face blanching beyond the color of bone. Then he folded it with stiff fingers and said only, "Prepare the boy. He leaves within the hour." No explanation, no destination, no request for medical clearance or psychological evaluation. Just removal. The doctors protested. They had been studying Isaac's abilities for weeks. They had accumulated piles of notes, equations, diagrams, strange mathematical structures that made even seasoned physicists uneasy. "Washington wants him," one of the strangers said flatly. "He is no longer your concern." Isaac was found seated on the edge of his bed, barefoot, staring at the wall where he had once drawn numbers in the dust. He didn't look up when the guards entered. He didn't resist when they placed a coat around his thin shoulders. He didn't speak at all. His hands, though, those shook. The strangers guided him down the hallway, their polished boots echoing off the concrete like a slow, deliberate metronome. Staff members stood silently as the procession passed, each carrying the same unspoken dread. They were witnessing the end of something they did not fully understand. At the exit, Isaac paused. He glanced back only once. Not at the doctors, not at the building. At the chalkboard he had used on his first day. A final flicker of recognition, then the door shut behind him, cutting the facility off from the coon. Child, it had broken. The carriage waiting outside was unmarked, its windows blackened, the horses restless, as though sensing a burden they didn't want to pull. The strangers lifted Isaac inside without a word. By the time the sun rose over Dayton, the carriage was gone, vanished into the white blur of morning fog. Hours later, the staff gathered in the briefing room. Dr. Harrington stood before them with the sealed envelope in hand. A different envelope now, this one addressed to the facility. He broke the wax. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Effective immediately, all research, records, and materials related to Subject YG are classified under federal statute. Unauthorized disclosure constitutes treason. Treason. The word struck the room like an electric crackle. One of the researchers swallowed. "Sir, our notes? Our observations?" "Sealed," Harrington said. "All of them." "What will Washington do with him?" someone asked. Harrington hesitated. "The letter does not say." But speculation spread quickly, muttering through the halls. A government training school, a private laboratory, a military program the public would never hear about, or something far worse. Something built not to teach a child, but to contain him. Within days, every trace of Isaac Granger vanished from the Dayton facility. His sheets burned, his drawings locked away, his name struck from the registry. In official documents, he ceased to exist. And from that morning onward, no one in Ohio ever saw him again. Rumors survived. Truth did not. For 57 years, the box sat untouched in a government storage room, stacked among broken barometers, obsolete storm measuring devices, and paper files so sun-faded that entire decades of research had turned the color of old bone. The crate bore a simple stenciled label, U.S. Weather Bureau, 1891. Property of Atmospheric Study Division. No one had opened it since the Cleveland blizzard of that year, and no one cared to. The box was heavy, dusty, and irrelevant, at least until March of 1948, when a junior archive clerk named Raymond Ellis was tasked with purging non-essential meteorological materials to make room for Cold War weather mapping equipment. He pried open the crate, expecting rusted instruments, broken glass tubes, and notes about snowfall patterns. He did not expect mathematics. Inside were dozens of folders bound with twine, paper, brittle, yellow, and humming with a faint static smell, as if time itself had charged them. The first page bore a name Ellis didn't recognize. Property of Dayton Research Facility. Subject YG. He frowned. The Weather Bureau had never operated a Dayton facility, but curiosity outweighed protocol. He untied the twine and began reading. His breath caught. The pages were covered in equations, dense, sweeping structures of symbols, spirals of numbers arranged like constellations. Some looked vaguely familiar, like extensions of 19th-century thermodynamics. Others resembled storm motion predictions, but so advanced they felt more like prophecy than science. But several pages, those he didn't have names for. They mirrored diagrams he had once glimpsed in a restricted physics seminar, patterns whispered about in the classified corridors of Los Alamos and Princeton. Patterns connected to emerging ideas scientists were only beginning to articulate: quantized motion, particle transitions, non-classical probability, the kind of theory, as no one on Earth had formulated in 1891. Ellis stared at one particular sheet. A swirling matrix of variables formed a shape he recognized, not from any 19th century text, but from a presentation his colleague had shown him only weeks earlier. A diagram meant to explain wave-particle duality, but this drawing was dated March 1891. His pulse quickened. He turned to the last page in the stack. It was different. No numbers, no equations, just a message written in small, careful handwriting, hands that trembled yet never slipped. Numbers don't lie, but the men who study them do. At the bottom, I.G. Ellis sat back, stunned. He wasn't reading the work of a forgotten meteorologist. He was reading the writings of a child who had been doing quantum-level mathematics before quantum physics even existed. A child the government had erased. He brought the box to his supervisor. Within an hour, the crate was removed. 2 hours later, every person who had seen its contents was instructed to sign a confidentiality document under national security regulation. By nightfall, the 1891 crate was gone. Removed not to be stored, but to be absorbed into a deeper archive, one Ellis would never again be permitted to enter. All he was left with was a memory, a single sentence written by a boy lost to history, a warning, a confession, and a truth dangerous enough to bury for almost 6 decades. Numbers don't lie, but the men who study them do. In the decades after the archive box was quietly reclassified and buried again under a new inventory code, a strange pattern began to appear in the margins of America's scientific progress. Physicists studying turbulence, probability, and quantum behavior kept stumbling upon the same problem. Half of Isaac Granger's diagrams could eventually be explained by modern theory. The other half, no one could decipher them. A Princeton researcher in 1956 remarked privately, "Whoever wrote this understood mathematics that won't exist for another 50 years." In 1974, a physicist at Caltech compared one of Isaac's spiraling grids to early quantum field equations and found something unnerving. The boy's structure predicted particle interactions no one would observe until the late 20th century. Not guessed, not approximated, predicted. And yet his drawings were made in a winter dormitory in 1891, with broken chalk and scraps of wood, while snow tapped on orphanage windows. But Isaac hadn't been guessing. Not according to the men who examined him. Not according to his own final words. "The world talks," he once whispered. "I just write what it says." Modern scientists debated what that meant. Some believed it was metaphor, symmetry, pattern recognition, the brilliance of a savant mind. But others wondered if Isaac had tapped into something even more mysterious. Not magic, not superstition, but the deep, mathematical structure of nature that most minds could only glimpse through equations. What if Isaac hadn't been inventing new math? What if he had been listening to it? By the 1990s, physicists studying chaos theory realized that one of Isaac's diagrams, long dismissed as meaningless scribble, mirrored the exact shape of the Lorentz attractor, a structure discovered more than 70 years after Isaac vanished. Another of his drawings resembled the Feynman diagram for electron positron on exchange. Yet Isaac had no education, no access to books, no training, no language for what he saw. Perhaps the most unsettling discovery came in 2003 when a mathematician revisiting the archive noted that Isaac's unsolved symbols resembled predictive models now used in climate forecasting. Not the 19th century hand-drawn maps, but the supercomputer-driven simulations of the modern era. How could a boy in an orphanage have drawn anything like that? The US government, of course, denied the documents existed at all. As for Isaac's fate, no official record remains. No death certificate, no burial, no census entry after 1891. The Dayton facility that held him left no medical logs identifying him by name. The few surviving staff members insisted they remembered no such boy. A child whose mind could trace the shape of storms before storms existed, who could sense invisible particles decades before anyone named them, who could see mathematics the way others saw color, simply disappeared. Some believe he was taken to a deeper facility, one whose records remained locked. Others think he died from the mental weight of the numbers he carried. And a few whisper that a mind like Isaac's does not vanish. It is hidden. But this much is known. In the winter of 1891, inside a cold Cleveland orphanage with creaking floorboards and frost on the windows, a quiet boy began to write on the walls, and in broken chalk and trembling hands, he wrote the future. Then, he was gone. And that brings us to the end of tonight's mystery. What do you think happened to Isaac Granger, the boy who spoke in numbers? Was he a forgotten prodigy? A government secret? Or something far stranger? Let me know your theory in the comments. I read every one of them. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you never miss another historical mystery. Until next time, sleep well. And if you ever find yourself hearing patterns where there shouldn't be any, pay attention. You never know what the world is whispering.